Let's start off by talking about what Tourette syndrome actually is. Tourette syndrome is a neurological condition that manifests itself in a variety of movements and vocalizations that are called tics. It's an uncommon disease, but it's not a rare one. The best estimates suggest that about 1 in 100 Americans will experience Tourette at some point in their lives. It usually manifests itself early in life, at about age 4 or 5, and it tends to reach a peak of severity at about age 12. The progress from there varies widely. Now, for some people, Tourette symptoms moderate or even disappear after reaching maturity. For others, they may endure, they may increase, or they may disappear for years only to re-emerge violently later on. No good explanation exists for the variation in these patterns, nor is there any way to predict what course any individual's symptoms will take. And indeed, variability is one of the most striking and puzzling features of Tourette syndrome. Tics, for instance, can take a lot of different forms. The most common are physical ones, physical tics. Things like eye blinks, grimaces, head shakes, shoulder shrugs, fist clenches, and a variety of visible or invisible muscle contractions. Now, while virtually anyone with Tourette has physical tics, we'll also have usually a few different ones, right? Most of my informants have been able to describe a dozen or so tics that have bothered them during their lives at some point. But each person's inventory of tics is somewhat different, and it varies from day to day, month to month, and year to year. It even varies with different activities. Some people find that watching television calms their tics, for example, while other people find that the same thing sets them off. Now, oral or vocal tics are also common in Tourette, although much less so. While most people with Tourette have had them at some point or another, they're not pervasive in the way that physical tics are. Now, oral tics can take a number of different forms. Most of them are relatively unobtrusive. Hisses, peeps, peep, throat clearing, coughs. In a small percentage of cases, they take the form of actual words, and sometimes these words are context dependent. There's a kind of tic called echolalia, for instance, in which the last word or phrase of a sentence has to be repeated. Either a sentence you speak yourself, or a sentence someone else speaks to you. There's also coprolalia, in which the word that's spoken is an obscene or inappropriate one. Now, coprolalia is very noticeable, of course, much more noticeable than head shakes or coughing, and so it's the Tourette symptom that gets noticed more than any other. Most people, when they think of Tourette, think of it as the cursing disease. Now, that's not really true. Only about 15% of people with Tourette ever experience coprolalia, and only a small percentage of those have it all the time. Even for people with coprolalia, moreover, cursing is only one of a number of tics they have, and it's often not the most troublesome. All right, two other things I should mention about tics. One is that they can be either simple or complex. A simple tic involves a single movement or vocalization, clearing your throat perhaps, or blinking an eye. Complex tics involve multiple movements that occur together. One of my informants, for example, has a frequent tic that involves sticking his tongue out the corner of his mouth, blowing a puff of air out of the right corner of his mouth, and goggling his eyes wide open, all performed within the space of about half a second. I can't do it. Sometimes he has a version of the tic that also involves a short hoot. Now, this is actually quite difficult to do. You may want to try it sometime. Not now, but sometime. And if you do it, you'll risk spraining your tongue. I've given up on it. Most people with Tourette have a mix of simple and complex tics. Now, the other thing to point out is that tics, even vocal tics, are physical acts. They are not communicative acts. A grimace or a shoulder roll or a hiss or a cough is not a message. People with Tourette don't do it to make a point or to get a rise out of people or to convey an impression of themselves. The tics are experienced as physical acts without any semantic content. Now, this is important. And it's important to know that it is just as true for vocal tics as it is for physical ones. Even coprolalia, which appears to people who hear it as a curse, is not a speech act. It's a tic, one which happens to take the form of a curse, but which isn't experienced any differently from a twitch or a cough. Now, it's hard to convince people of that. If you hear a person bark out a word that rhymes with truck every 30 seconds, it's hard to believe he isn't trying to tell you something, but he's not. One of my informants who had quite severe coprolalia put it this way. He said, when people hear me say that, they assume that it's like a boiling tea kettle, that there are all kinds of horrible thoughts swirling around in my head, and that my mind is just so full of curses that every now and then one of them pops out. But that's not true at all, and it's very hard to convince people of that. And I have to say that the people whom I've interviewed who have coprolalia have been, on the whole, unusually well-spoken people who are very careful about the way they use language. One of them told me, I have a problem with the F word. She wouldn't use that word in conversation. She would never actually say it. When it came out of her mouth, which it did, she wasn't speaking. She was having a tic, which felt to her no different from a cough or a twitch. Now that, of course, raises the question, why is the curse rather than a cough or a twitch? And the answer, I'm afraid, is that we really don't know. Tourette is a neurological disorder, not a psychological one. People who have tics aren't doing them to express repressed feelings or anything like that. We know that much. But there is an awful lot about Tourette that is still very obscure. We do know that Tourette is associated with disorders in a specific part of the brain, the basal ganglia and the corticostriato-thalamocortical circuits. But we don't know exactly what's causing that dysfunction, or what neurotransmitters are involved, or what causes it to vary so much from person to person. We know that it has a genetic basis because it tends to run in families, and since identical twins are much more likely to share it than fraternal twins. But even identical twins who have the same DNA only share Tourette syndrome about 70% of the time. And their particular symptoms and the severity of those symptoms can be very different. We know that it's connected to some psychiatric disorders, especially with obsessive compulsive disorder. Rates of comorbidity with OCD are very, very high. And in fact, all the people I've interviewed have said that they think that they qualify for an OCD diagnosis. But Tourette and OCD are not the same thing, and they don't overlap completely. Perhaps most importantly, they don't respond to medication the same way. The drugs that help OCD don't help Tourette symptoms, and in some cases, they can actually make them worse. In fact, drug therapies for Tourette are generally quite unsatisfactory. Speaking generally, Tourette isn't something that medical science can make go away. It's something people have to find a way to live with. And by and large, they have to figure that out for themselves. In most cases, when I've interviewed someone with Tourette, I am the first person they have ever spoken to about it at length. There is no sense in which people with Tourette constitute any sort of community. They have to figure out their accommodations for it individually. Now, how they do that, of course, is a large part of what my research is about, and it's part of what makes Tourette so interesting from an anthropological perspective. Tourette is what we might call a social disease, right? Not the old meaning of social disease that you heard in West Side Story, but rather a disease whose effect is primarily a social one. Tourette doesn't hurt, at least most of the time. It doesn't shorten life. It doesn't reduce intelligence. It doesn't limit mobility or reproductive capacity or anything like that. What it does is make social life difficult. There are profound stigmas associated with tics. People immediately associate them either with psychological or with moral dysfunction, and the associations are very, very strong ones. Right? Leave aside the obvious stigmas associated with coprolalia for the moment. Even minor tics tend to be interpreted as evidence that the person is psychologically unstable or morally corrupt or both. Right? One way to get a sense of this is to just cast your mind back and think of any character you've ever seen in a movie or a book who has a tic, right? Maybe a twitching eye or an oral hiss or goes like this with his finger, something like that. Invariably, characters like that are either homicidal maniacs, sexual deviants, or evil masterminds bent on world domination, sometimes all three at once. People react very strongly to tics and very immediately. And in doing so, they tend to distance themselves from the people who display them. So Tourette poses a problem for people who have it. If their tics are perceived, then they themselves will be misperceived. They will be seen as dangerous or deviant, or at least as mentally disturbed people, which I want to emphasize that they are not. In order to live normal lives, therefore, they have to find ways of shaping the ways that people perceive their tics. In a sense, Tourette forces people into agency, into a conscious and strategic engagement with the cultural meanings of their physical selves.